Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Well, the U.S. has made an important decision. More specifically, President Biden of the U.S. has made a decision to temporarily waive patents, in fact, at this point in time. This specifically when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccines. This has been an issue, as we know, for a while now. We've discussed this previously on the show as well, that at the WTO, I believe it is 100-plus countries had put a request forth for waivers on patents so that certain countries around the world who are able to will be able to produce their own vaccines, considering the waiver on those patents. Pharmaceutical companies, as one would expect, were against this. They've even released a statement, which I know we will discuss further in this show with our esteemed panelist who is joining us now. We're now joined by Dr. Yuan Qiong, who is a senior legal and policy advisor for Access Campaign, the Access Campaign, run by Doctors Without Borders, or MSF. She is joining us today from Geneva. Yuan, thank you very much for taking your time out to speak to us. I know that MSF has also been, lobbying for this very decision to take place. How important is this? What does this then mean going forward?
Thank you very much. We are very excited to hear this announcement from US last night. As you rightly pointed out, we have been advocating for the decision to be made by WTO members in Geneva since last October. So the announcement of US is really a significant step that we hope can generate the concrete decision made by WTO members. And we also hope, because there's still a few countries did not really commit to come to the negotiation table and make this decision, they should also take action now, including European Union, United Kingdom, Norway, Australia, Canada, Japan. So those countries should follow US steps and take actions and come to the negotiation table.
So the goal here is, now that the patent may be waived, and I know that there is still a discussion and a deal to be reached at the WTO, but in the situation that deal is reached, what does this mean on the ground for poorer countries? Does this automatically, I would think that there will still be an issue of infrastructure possibly about which countries can actually make their own vaccines?
Yeah, so exactly. So because in the pandemic, we are facing very complex challenges and multiple level of barriers in order to leverage the global capacity to produce and supply vaccines, but also other medical products. Actually, the waiver proposal from South Africa and India covers vaccine and other products such as the treatment and diagnostic and materials and associated technologies. We need to mobilize the global society, global capacity to do that. But in order to reach that point, the monopoly that held by pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer and others, who for the moment do not have a plan to share their technology with developing country manufacturers and have the risk of enforcing their intellectual property on vaccines and other technologies. The waiver, if adopted and implemented by countries, would really help to remove those legal barriers that are present and also anticipated to emerge in the coming few months, so that government and companies in developing country can be freed from those legal barriers and then start preparing for scaling up production and a diversified supply. So as you rightly pointed out, we wouldn't have an overnight change, like everybody will get vaccine because of the waiver, because there's a lot of practical steps to go. But the earlier the waiver can be adopted as an important enabler, the quicker we could see the impact on the ground.
As a final comment then, Yuan, the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, as you may have heard, has said waiving patents on COVID-19 vaccines was in fact, and I'm quoting them directly, the wrong answer to a complex problem, and they've called for more technology transfer agreements instead. They've gone on to say that this will not increase production or provide practical solutions needed to battle the global health crisis. In fact, it may lead to more disruption. How do you respond to that?
So they have been saying this since last year, but the reality is that the claimed technology transfer agreement pharmaceutical companies signed are mostly untransparent. So we don't exactly know what they are signing and doing. And most of their agreement, as far as the limited public information shows, are so-called contract manufacturer agreements, meaning that the big industry, such as Pfizer, Moderna, and others, will return the legal rights to determine, they give some production services for developing countries, some partner they choose to work with, but they wouldn't allow them, the producers, to make a decision on where to supply. One typical example is, as we know, Johnson & Johnson had some partnership with a South African company to produce vaccine, but the South African company is not allowed to supply the local public health needs beyond a friction they only are allowed to supply 9% of what they produce to their country. So this is the kind of control the Pharmaceutical Federation is advocating for. On another hand, waiving intellectual property is not exclusive, so company can continue doing their partnership and transferring technology. And there's also WHO initiative asking for joint force and collective way of sharing technology. Mm-hmm. The issue is that the big industry represented by PMA has refused those initiatives. So we need an additional option for government to really step in, making sure technology are openly shared and that there's no legal risk for a company who can already start preparing their production.
Very well, Yuan. We'll leave there at that, but we really, really appreciate you taking your time out today to share your expertise with us. We're sharing good news with you finally when it comes to this patent waiver issue, when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccines. This is only, of course, the first step. As I said, at the WTO, there still needs to be a deal reached. However, for President Biden to take this step is significant, even though it's significantly late into the process, but hopefully it will prepone then all those fatalistic, alarming statistics about how long it would take for poorer countries to be able to even have their populations vaccinated, thus increasing the risk to all of us around the world of more and more variants. So even on the most selfish point of view, it is in fact logical to have the whole world vaccinated so that new variants don't keep coming up and for the rest of us to remain safe and healthy. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now we're going to discuss in an extended segment the Iran-Vienna nuclear talks, essentially, to revive the Iran nuclear deal. The U.S. Under Biden has attempted, or is saying that it's attempting to re-enter the JCPOA. However, of course, there continue to be hiccups along the path. A lot has changed in the year since Donald Trump walked away from the deal, the regional realities as well as other realities as well, vis-a-vis sanctions, etc. Now, the news coming out of Vienna is not positive in the sense that there are hiccups along the way. There are obstacles which haven't been able to overcome, such as a sanctions relief that the Iranians do want, and as is stipulated even within the JCPOA deal, as well as the issue of centrifuges, etc. All of the above becoming sticking points, and for both sides to be able to then move forward with the deal at this point in time, even though, as we know, throughout the process, there has been a lot of positive rhetoric coming out from all sides as well about progress, but it seems that at the last moments that things haven't necessarily worked out, at least as of now. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're firstly joined by Dr. Hans-Jakob Schindler and Dr. Hamid Mousavi. Hans is a former German security official who served at the German embassy in Tehran from the years 2005 to 2011. He's joining us today from Berlin. Joining us from Tehran is Hamid, who is an assistant professor of the Faculty of Law and Political Science at the University of Tehran. He was previously an adjunct professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Hamid and Hans, thank you both for taking your time out of your schedules to join us today. Hamid, let me start with you. Was it expected? I would think it was expected that there would be these hiccups along the way. I mean, the Iranians have been insistent upon having what was promised to them under the deal, i.e. sanctions relief.
Yes, so I think it's very early to talk about results. We have to remember that the nuclear negotiations that led to the deal in the first place took several years to complete, and the negotiations in Vienna have only been going on for a few weeks, and these hiccups are expected. Nevertheless, the reason for the time frame that is being pushed is that first we have the Iranian presidential elections in less than 2 months. Also, the deal Iran has with the IAEA is expiring before the end of May. So there is the push to reach a deal. Nevertheless, I think it's still very early to talk about actual results. Also, if the results are not reached in the next 2 months, then I think we have to wait for the next Iranian government to restart negotiations, and that might take a while on its own. So I think it's still too early to tell.
And Hamid there makes a good point about, of course, about timelines. But do you think that the Americans have this sort of time? Do we have the luxury of time here at this time to be able to take this slowly? Because it seems that as more time passes by since Donald Trump walked away from the deal, it'll only become harder to re-enter the deal, won't it?
On the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, it's also an extraordinarily difficult political and legal system that the Americans have to deal with. Don't forget, there's been an enormous amount of additional sanctions that the Trump administration imposed, not only outside the JCPOA confines, which allows sanctions other than related to the nuclear program, but also double and triple sanctioning entities that were sanctioned relieved under the JCPOA agreement. So to roll all of these back is going to be extremely difficult on the American side. Legally speaking, under what provision will have to be rolled back. And then, of course, there is the whole domestic issue, not just on the Iranian side, but also on the American side, because Iran negotiations are not a very popular issue with a lot of the decision makers in Congress. And although the Democrats hold the majority both houses at the moment, they have not a necessary majority to push through whatever they like. So it is also quite difficult on the American side. So it's better to make sure that maybe we take a couple more weeks, but then get a deal that is, as Biden put it, longer and stronger than last time.
Ahmed, I wonder how you assess the Iranian decision to have the centrifuges increase in production and the 60% purity. I mean, all of the above, even the Europeans say that they have not appreciated because they, at least in their words, are trying to ensure that this deal survives. Is Iran making life hard for itself?
Well, I mean, if you look at this from Tehran's perspective, Iran has actually received very little incentive or positive signals from the Biden administration. The expectation in Iran was that when Biden took office, that he would lift at least some of the sanctions. Nevertheless, in reality, the so-called maximum pressure campaign on Iran has continued without any interference. Not a single sanction on Iran has been lifted. So from Iran's perspective, Iran is obliging by its side of the deal without getting any of the economic incentives that were promised under the deal. So as a result, you can understand why Iran is actually reducing its obligations. I think for the negotiations to succeed, Iran has to see some goodwill from the American side, because we have to remember that it was the Americans that left the deal, and there is a lot of mistrust from the Iranian side regarding America's intentions. And this is not only the Biden administration. I mean, Donald Trump is already talking about a 2024 comeback. So how can Iran trust that the deal would survive if a new deal is reached? And regarding the issue of stronger, longer, or better, a so-called nuclear deal 2.0, I think from the Iranian perspective, when the Americans say they want a better deal, it means a better deal for them and not necessarily for Iran. So they want more restrictions on Iran's nuclear program. And essentially, they haven't even delivered on the sanctions removal front. So I think it's a very difficult situation that we're dealing with.
So, Hans, tell me what the European thought process is at this time when it comes to the centrifuges. Is that an obstacle this time? I mean, the Europeans, at least I would imagine, would claim that, listen, we've done what we could to save the deal and to encourage, obviously, the Americans to come back into the fold. On the other side, as you well know, there are Iranian grievances, even just purely with how the Europeans have acted, even since Donald Trump walked away from the deal.
Well, I mean, from the European perspective, of course, maintaining the deal as an internationally agreed and United Nations Security Council mandated legal agreement is a priority. I just want to, in brackets, mention that the deal is a much better deal as it stands for Iran, because for the last 2 years, they've made great strides and put very purposefully a lot of investment in centrifuge development that they would have not been able to do if nothing had changed under the Trump administration with the JCPOA. Plus, the timelines contained in the JCPOA have now moved more than 2 years forward. So the deal is considerably better for the Iranian side. I don't think there's a lot of worry that needs to go into this point. From the European side, of course, they had very clearly communicated that they have two priorities while maintaining the deal. One was not to, for Iran not to increase beyond the commercially useful 3% enriched uranium, and to keep maximum transparency with the IAEA. Both red lines really have been crossed for a while now. I mean, Iran is not only enriching already up to 20%, but now it has announced and it has started to enrich to 60%. Plus, while it maintains a cooperation with the IAEA, it's now all based on a voluntary, time-bound agreement. This is not exactly making it very easy for the Europeans to nudge their American colleagues in the right direction.
Hans and Hamid, the clock has gotten the best of us. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there at that, but we really appreciate both of you taking your time out to share your insight with us. We're discussing, and we will discuss in the next part as well, these continuing talks. As Hamid there said, this is a slow process. I mean, this may very well take long, but I wonder, as I put to Hans, if either side has, in fact, the luxury of time at this point to save this deal. I'll be back after this break, continuing the discussion. Welcome back, viewers. We're going to continue to discuss, as we did in the first segment of this topic, about the Iran-Vienna talks, those talks taking place for the United States to seemingly try to re-enter the JCPOA. They seem to have hit a number of hurdles, as we discussed in the first half as well, such as sanctions relief and the centrifuges that Iran has started churning at a greater rate at this time. Let's continue that conversation. We're now joined by Gregory Aftandilian, who is an adjunct professor at Boston and American universities. He's joining us this morning from McLean in Virginia. And joining us from Tehran is Mostapha Khoshcheshm, who is a senior Iran affairs analyst, I should say, and a university professor. Mostapha and Gregory, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Gregory, let me start with you. So on the side of the other side, if I may use that term, the American side, the issue for the Iranians is that of sanctions relief, and the Americans saying, of course, that this would need to be done simultaneously and or in a step-by-step process. That seems to have been the roadblock at this point in time. Do you get the feeling that the Americans will be able to compromise on that at any point in the near future?
Well, it really depends on a number of events. In other words, if the Iranians then slowly get back into the nuclear deal, then there could be a step-by-step process for the United States to lift sanctions. In other words, you do step A, we'll do step B, and then we can go down that road. But I think it would be very difficult for the Biden administration all of a sudden to lift all the sanctions, because then the United States would believe that its bargaining power would then lessen. And then, of course, President Biden would get a lot of criticism at home, especially from the Republicans in Congress about that approach to the nuclear deal.
Mostapha Khoshcheshm, do you think that the Iranians realize on the other side how difficult this is politically as well for the Biden administration to be able to get through? And secondly, I also wanted to add this on. Do you think the timeline might have been unrealistic? I mean, it took a very, very long time for this nuclear deal even to be reached, the original nuclear deal I'm talking about. And maybe our timeline of re-entering the deal was a bit too optimistic.
Well, thanks for having me. Well, let's talk about strategies. Iran doesn't believe that the U.S. is honest. And this comes not because of illusions, but because of experience, because of history that we have experienced. When the nuclear deal started, there were to be reciprocal moves, but Iran did all its undertakings, and Iran's undertakings are physical. I mean, when you dismantle cascade of centrifuges, then many of them crash. And when you oxidize your enriched uranium, you may not return it to the form that it was before. So you have already lost it, and you may not revive it and return it to the previous condition. Once Iran did all its undertakings, the Obama administration that was more or looked more liberal or more interested in working the deal with Iran, he never removed the sanctions in practice. He issued orders over the paper, but Iran never felt the economic merits that were involved in the content of the nuclear deal paragraphs 25 to 29. Iran never felt that. So Iran has this bad experience, and it believes that the U.S. is not under the deal for resolving the conflict. The United States approach is containment and not conflict resolution. So this time, Iran would not do any kind of reciprocal move. It would wait first for all the sanctions imposed on the country after the 2015 nuclear deal to be removed first. Then it wants enough time for verification, somewhere between 3 to 6 months, and then it has vowed to, do all its undertakings that it has modified.
Look, Gregory, and this is not new, of course. I mean, the Iranians have always said at this point it's about the Americans needing to prove themselves, because again, within the deal, they were promised certain things which they have not so far, gotten those benefits of. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, Biden as a candidate was very opposed to the Trump decision to pull out of the deal, then to slap on the sanctions. So right now, the whole idea is to get back into the deal, but you can't sort of throw everything on the table all at once, because Iran now has enriched uranium to something in the order of 60%. And that's much, much higher, of course, than what the nuclear deal had stipulated. So I think it's sort of unrealistic to expect the U.S. to all of a sudden remove all of the sanctions. And then, of course, some of the sanctions are separate from the nuclear-related sanctions. In other words, there are still sanctions on the books on the terrorism issue that's separate from the nuclear deal. So the sanctions issue is a very complicated one, but through diplomacy, that's the nature of the art of diplomacy. One side has one position, one side has another position, and through negotiations, you try to work out some type of sequence or some type of deal. And I think that's where the Biden administration is now trying to do. But it's a very difficult one. And of course, there's bad feelings on both sides between Iran and the U.S. for a lot of historical reasons, which we don't have time to get into. But that's the situation.
Khoshcheshm, I wonder, in your mind, do you think that we're in a very different position from where we were right before the nuclear deal? Because even then, right, it wasn't a sure thing. There was still talk of it possibly falling apart. And then when it was signed, I mean, that was the only time that we knew that, okay, this has actually gone through. And this was, again, as I said in my introduction, a long-fought deal, the original one I'm discussing. Will this be the same case? As in, are we in for a very long process? Do the Iranians have the appetite for a long process?
Of course not. Iran has stressed repeatedly that it would not go for marathon talks. But let me explain what my colleague said about the nature of the sanctions. That, as he said, that the nature of the sanctions are separate, and some are under terrorism allegations, some others for missile or human rights issues, and some others for nuclear-related issues. That's not the case. Let's not forget the framework that the U.S. Is not for resolving the conflict with Iran. This JCPOA is a means, actually, in order to harness and contain Iran from the American side of, unfortunately. Ever since the U.S. exited, even before the U.S. exited the deal, ever since they struck the deal, even under Obama was the first violator of the nuclear deal, they started copy-pasting the nuclear-related sanctions, especially under Donald Trump. They started CAATSA, Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, and then they went for other sanctions. They copy-pasted the nuclear-related sanctions and placed them in a second layer, but under a different label called terrorism. Again, they did a copy-pasting and placed the similar, identical sanctions in a third layer under human rights allegations, under missile allegations. So they call it fortifying sanctions wall regulation or rule. That's been done so as to keep the sanctions structure intact and in place, even if one day the nuclear deal is revived. It's not a Donald Trump strategy. When his national security advisor was asked, he said, no matter who comes to power, a Biden administration or a Donald Trump administration, this is a mechanism to receive more and more merits from Iran. In other words, we removed the nuclear-related sanctions, but we have not done that, actually. As a matter of fact, we have kept it in place to ask for more merits for an agreement over Iran's missile power, regional power, and so on and so forth. So this is a game for the United States. This is the containment strategy of the U.S. Okay. And as long as the U.S. looks at Iran issue through this view, it's not going to be resolved.
All right, we'll leave it there at that. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We appreciate both Mostapha and Gregory for their time. And of course, earlier we had Hamid and Hans also speaking to us about this topic. We discussed how diplomacy hopefully is the mantra of the day, and hopefully it will be through diplomacy that we'll be able to have the Americans re-enter the JCPOA if that's really their intention. On both sides, there is mistrust because of what has happened, not just under Donald Trump, but the Americans, or the Iranians, I should say, would even point back to the Obama years and say that even under Obama, there wasn't a complete respect of what the Iranians were promised within the deal. Again, very tough issues to resolve, and hopefully they will all be resolved around the negotiating table instead of a further escalation and or a complete collapse of the deal. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and on the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a topic which we've discussed quite a few times on this show, and that is domestic terrorism or domestic extremism within the United States, also termed as white supremacy. I mean, there's a whole host of phrases that we can possibly use when it comes to that issue. Nevertheless, it is an issue which is increasingly coming into the spotlight, and we've now had the U.S. Attorney General requesting an extra $85 million in funding from Congress to bolster the Justice Department and FBI's efforts to combat domestic terrorism. He's even warning that the situation right now is more of a dangerous period than what Oklahoma City and the United States faced in the wake of the 1995 attack, which killed 168 people at that time, also by a white extremist. Is this an issue of throwing money at the problem, or is this an issue of ideology and changing one's mindset and how they deal with these sorts of groups, or how they even view security threats as a whole? Because for such a long time, terrorism and extremism was always seen as a foreign threat versus that of a domestic threat. And maybe it is time for more of an ideological change than rather just something like throwing money at the issue altogether. Let's discuss those issues and others further. We're now joined by Dr. Oscar Odom III, who is a retired NYPD detective and criminal justice professor at ASA College. He's joining us today from Brooklyn, New York. And joining us this morning from Delaware, Ohio, is Dr. Brianna Mack, who is an assistant professor of politics and government at Ohio Wesleyan University. Brianna and Oscar, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Oscar, let me start with you. Obviously, I mean, money is welcome because money probably means a lot more resources. But is this enough in and of itself to deal with the issue of domestic extremism?
They take an oath, and the oath said basically that they will defend and support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. We've been dealing so much before with foreign. Now we have domestic rising on our hands. We look at the event of January 6th and seen how it was full-blown and how it is still escalating all across the country. The thing is, you know, part of my career, I served in the intelligence division when I was in NYPD. And one of the things is that the public does not have or is not privy to all the information that is out there. The intelligence community is privy to a lot of information. So therefore, they know what they're talking about. And I think that the Attorney General is correct in requesting the money to combat this domestic terrorism, because before it was always 1993, the attempt on the World Trade, and then 9/11, and then also, of course, the Oklahoma City bombing. So we have all the light bulbs going off. And if we don't do anything, it's going to be on us. Like the report during the 9/11 Commission when they said we didn't share information, else we could have did something about it. Now we know, so we must act. And I agree with the Attorney General.
Now, what are your thoughts on this? Will this money, and I mean it's a significant amount of money, of course, 85 million in additional funding, will this go a long way? And is this enough of the strategy to actually properly tackle the issue of domestic extremism?
I do believe this is a step in the right direction. So I do believe that, yes, with the increase of domestic terrorism in light, and I think not in light, the insurrection attempt on January 6th was the biggest example. And what maybe some folks fail to realize is since then, that rhetoric about stopping the still happens. You still have congressmen and women who still believe that President Trump, his election was stolen. The election was stolen from him. And so what we need to see ultimately with this proposal from the Justice Department is to see whether or not they have steps in place to accurately identify these individuals and then trying to figure out exactly how they're going to be prosecuted. Because one of the arguments from the Republican side, from the right side, is that this could just be no more of a witch hunt. And so like in cases where they've actually identified some of the participants, they've been put in jail and they're in the process of being sentenced, but some people on the right side could just continue to look at this like a witch hunt.
Oscar, you know, this is also, isn't it, a battle of ideology, apart from just dealing with the very violent threats and realities that do exist. But I mean, in an era where Donald Trump is still extremely relevant as a political figure, and I'm not trying to put this all on Trump's shoulders. I know this is an issue which has existed way before Donald Trump as well, but nevertheless, that seems to have brought this to the fore. We do have a divided country, don't we? And how then does one deal with domestic extremism as well as hopefully unite the American people?
I think President Biden is doing a great job at that now. He has taken the first steps to extend the olive branch. And we must, you know, America is built on so many different things. And the thing is, the great thing about this country is we have freedom of speech. And we have the right to say things. But also under the United States Constitution, when you look at freedom of speech, a lot of people don't realize that free speech is not absolute. You can have something called time, place, and manner restrictions on that free speech. So what needs to happen now is that they need to move forward. They need the money for this investigation. As the oath states, we need to combat enemies, foreign and domestic, and the ones that are domestic, we need to address the issue, to put a nip on it, so to speak, and also to begin to prosecute to show that this is what democracy is about, not what they were doing on January 6th. And so this will put the nail in the coffin, so to speak, to let the American public know that we are serious about this. We're going to combat this, and we're going to make America great as it should be.
You know, Brianna, I would think for those on the other side, and I'm saying those who are possibly supporters of Donald Trump, as well as just entirely this ideology, their grievances are very real to them, right? So how does one snap them out of that, so to speak? How does one convince them, even those who are not really, don't have any violent tendencies necessarily, but still do in their heart of hearts believe a lot of this extremist rhetoric?
If I knew the answer to that, I think I'd probably be a full professor in a lofty, bigger university than Ohio Wesleyan. But I think for right now, trying to convince these individuals that, you know, their beliefs are not, you know, their beliefs are just fictional or mythology, just plain incorrect, is not the right way to go about it. I think at this point, I just actually saw a news alert that showed that some of the Trump supporters within the House of Representatives is trying to push out Liz Cheney, and she has been one of the most senior members of the Republican Party in Congress that actually rejected the belief about stopping the steal and that, former President Trump was he had the election stolen from him. And so one of the ways that we can try and demonstrate that this is not a witch hunt or that the Justice Department is using this money for a witch hunt is to also identify groups, left-leaning ideology groups that have also been causing a ruckus here and there. And if they're also identified and then perhaps also, brought to trial or had charges placed against them, that could also alleviate some of the concerns from the right side. But there are not that many groups on the left side that have been, have been terrorizing the public, especially last summer.
That's a point, isn't it, Oscar? I'll give you that as a final word. We still have about a minute left. Do you think it's important, and is it important, in fact, let me put it this way, for there to be a balanced approach and for this not to seem like an attack on just conservatives?
Absolutely, I agree with my colleague. The thing is that is what America is about. We need the two parties. We fight with each other, but fight in a way to make America great. Or make things better or improve it. That's part of the framers in the United States Constitution. Everybody didn't sit down at the table and agree with everything. They had to argue their points out to see what was best for the country. And in doing this will be great because there are people on both sides, left and right, that have done some things that are wrong. So one way to unite is to sit at the table. And as my colleague just said, the people that were on the other side that were doing stuff wrong, to bring that to light also. And to also realize that people on both sides have both good and bad ideals, and we need to sit down and make it together and make sure everything is squared away. Like the United States Constitution says, when you take the oath, you take the oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against enemies, all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Very well, Oscar and Brianna, we'll leave there at that. We, as always, appreciate you taking your time out this morning to share your insight with us. We were discussing, as we have before, something that I said in my introduction as well, domestic extremism. Is throwing money at the issue a good first step? Both of our guests do agree that it is important, of course, have more resources to then put forth against this fight of domestic extremism and terrorism and white supremacy as a whole. At the same time, it's vital for this not to just become a Republican bashing, conservative bashing, Trump bashing fest. This needs to take a much more balanced approach, because if it doesn't, in fact, we'll probably have the threat of even having more extremists coming out because they'll feel cornered and targeted. And I think that that's something which we'll be keeping an eye on here in Scope as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.